As we look at the learning objectives for Russia, it's similar to what we looked at Europe. So we're going to look at the geographic features, then we're going to look at some of the ethnicity issues, talking about ethnic identity, as well as some of the conflicts that are currently occurring now, as well as in the past, and then especially focusing on the history of Russia and how it has impacted our geographic landscape. So kind of the core focus for this region is talking about ethnicity, which is just the identification of a group of people that have commonality regarding language, ancestry, or their cultural history. Again, just looking at where we're at in the world, of course, Russia toward the northern hemisphere, so that's going to lead to its colder climate, but very large, as we'll see here in just a little bit. Definitely the largest country that we'll see. So the physical features, again, it is the largest country in the world, makes up about 1/8 of the Earth's land mass. And if you know, I think it's a really cool website. It's called The True Size, but you can go in and kind of manipulate this to take an area and compare it. So if you see, you can take the land mass here of Russia, and it completely covers the United States and Canada up into Alaska. So it's a very huge part of the Earth's mass. So if you remember from Europe, there's a mountain range that separates Europe in Russia. So that mountain is the Ural Mountains that we see here. So we have Europe on the western side and in Russia on the eastern side of that. So the Ural Mountains is important as far as elevation, but also, again, that kind of natural boundary that separates it from Russia. Some of the other physical features, again, the eastern part of Russia is much more mountainous than the western side. So after the Ural Mountains, it's more plains and lower elevation, and then it becomes more mountainous on the eastern side. As far as rivers and water sources, the Volga River is the longest river in Russia. It connects Moscow to the Caspian Sea. That is important for transportation, providing kind of a waterway system to link it to the Caspian Sea. And then also, just kind of a little tidbit, Lake Baikal is actually the largest and deepest freshwater lake in the world. So if we look here at Russia, again, the elevation showing the more deeper reds and yellows indicates higher elevation. So again, the eastern part of Russia is much more mountainous than what the western side is, other than the Ural Mountains that separates it from Europe. All right, now looking at just some of the other kind of tidbits or physical features, here's that Lake Baikal. Again, compared to thinking about how big Russia is, this is a very large lake. Again, it's a freshwater lake. It's very deep. So again, provides a lot of water that can be used for various resources, as far as, of course, drinking water, but also for agriculture. And then again, the Volga River, the longest in Russia, close to Europe, so it's on the western side. But again, it allows a connection between Moscow, which is the city or the capital. Ooh, struggle there. But it allows that connection all the way into the Caspian Sea. So it allows for some transportation that helps with imports and exports. Now kind of switching into the climate and some of the biomes. So a biome is just a portion of, this is kind of more of a biology term, but a biome is a collection of land that shares commonality. So within Russia, there are 3 biomes. So the tundra, which is very cold, typically what we think about with Russia being very cold. So limited trees, lots of permafrost, so it's constantly frozen. The taiga, which is coniferous forest, so think about like pine trees. But then there is the steppe, which is that grassland plain in between, again, more on the western part where there are the lower lands that allow for some agriculture to occur. Now, as far as the climate, again, high latitudes that we're very close to the North Pole. So that equals that very cold climate that's going to be seen. Again, higher elevations, of course, are even going to be colder. So we think about those Ural Mountains, and then the other mountains over on the more on the eastern part of Russia. So then the lower elevations, of course, have a little bit warmer climates. The interior has the greatest temperature range. So remember, if we think about the Y, we talked about this with Europe. So if we think about the internal climate here of Russia, again, much more variable. So high extremes going in the summer compared to the winter months, whereas over closer into Moscow here and even over on the eastern side, it's much more temperate, meaning the temperatures don't fluctuate as much. And the reason for that is because of all of, let me just get rid of these. But the reason for that is due to all of the water. So remember the water, so earlier we're talking about the Arctic Ocean or here at the various seas that it's close to. Again, this is going to allow the temperatures to remain relatively constant because water has a great ability to maintain a constant temperature. So areas closer to water have a more temperate kind of typical climate, whereas farther away, we're going to get more extremes and more variation. All right, so most people live in the western part, which makes sense based on what we've talked about. So again, it's less mountainous, but also that agriculture of the plains allows for more resources to be made that supports a larger population. It's also closer to Europe for trading in goods, importing, exporting, that type of thing. Now, climate change is another thing that we mentioned before. It's going to be one of the big themes that we talk about in various regions, but especially here in Russia. So if we look at the degrees of warming, so from 1970 to 2019, you can see the area most affected is that closest to the North Pole. And of course, Russia being close to the North Pole, the impacts of climate change are more significant in this region. So it's predicted to have much more severe effects because, again, it's closer to that Arctic Circle. So we think about the glaciers melting, that increases sea level, leads to more severe storms, and again, just that increasing sea level. So the impacts particular to Russia, again, that permafrost that we just mentioned is part of the tundra where it has frost all year round. That is starting to thaw and become less permanent. So as it thaws, that causes erosion of the land, and it also releases more greenhouse gases that then further raises the temperature. So it's kind of this ongoing cycle that leads to higher and higher temperatures. It also allows, though, looking at the positive, access to more natural resources. So again, gases or fossil fuels or minerals, that type of thing that are under the permafrost, because it is always frozen, it's really hard to get to. So the thawing, the positive side of that is that it allows access to some of those natural resources. It also allows for some new sea routes and ports to the Arctic Ocean that can increase access to the seas, that can increase imports and exports. So again, climate change, we're ultimately focusing on, of course, as a negative impact globally, but in some regions it will have some positive impacts. However, unfortunately, the bad is always going to outweigh the good whenever we talk about the increasing temperature due to climate change. All right, now looking at some of the history, again, a little video here that goes through the expansion of Russia, but to hit some of the highlights. So in the 13th to 14th century, this is where Moscow was that important city-state. It was under monarch rule, so think about like a king, queen, more like we had seen in Europe. Then in the 14th and 18th century, there was a huge expansion. So from 20,000 square kilometers to 6 million. So drastically increasing the size of the country. And this is what brings us to that increase in diversity. So again, we said this was one of the main highlights or themes of this region. So again, whenever you talk about conquering or raiding or taking over other areas, that means that you have now incorporated different cultures, different backgrounds of individuals with different thinking. So again, either those are similar enough and they're accepted, or Unfortunately, in most cases, it leads to conflict, and one being made more superior to the others. So then in the 17th and 18th century, Peter the Great expanded more to the northwest and actually moved from Moscow to St. Petersburg to become the capital. So we can see here in this picture the expansion from 1462 to 1796 of just how all of that was happening. So this large expansion that was occurring. So originally, here around Moscow, just a small area is what actually started with what Russia was, and then as expanded and moved more to the east and more north during different rules where they were conquering. But again, going from a small area where individuals are pretty similar, now incorporating all of these different regions and ethnicities has led to a lot of conflict over the years. Now, moving into the 20th century, World War I led to large losses for Russia that was involved with that. So they lost a lot to their economy due to the loss of World War I. There was economic and political turmoil. There was a lot of civil war, again, to different beliefs politically, but also the ethnicity. So the citizens actually overthrew the Tsar. Bolshevik actually led, or the Bolsheviks, which were led by Lenin, took over the government from the USSR, which is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, which is what it was. So it used to be the Soviet Union. However, they were overcome and led into the current political system. So Lenin died in 1922, and Stalin, over here to the right, then took power and instituted communism. So they moved from that monarch system to communist and that collective agriculture. So if you remember our economies from our introduction, communist is where the government has complete control of what is made, how much it costs, and everything. So that is whenever this took over. So again, this is that command economy. So now with the economic goals of communists, again, a video here that nicely summarizes all of this. So again, collective agriculture. So this is, again, where the farms are owned by collections of people, not individuals. The goals of that is to increase the crop production. Work and reward are equally distributed. It supports the growing urban population, so it kind of fuels industrialism by, again, having more people who can go into industry and not as many needed on farms because it's more unionized, and the work it's kind of more efficient and can be done better. Now, the reality, though, as we're unfortunately well aware of, the work and especially the rewards are not equally distributed in most command economies, especially in Russia. So the government takes essentially what it wants and does not equally reward everyone or distribute that wealth. So crop production actually decreased so much that there was a large famine in the 1930s and about 6 million individuals starved. And again, the video talks about that. But essentially what had happened here was that in order to fund industrialization, as the government wanted to move more to that industrialization, it needed money to buy those machines. So what it did was it sold all the extra crops. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't extra crops. They were essentially selling all the crops, and it wasn't leaving enough for the farmers or for the workers in that. So it led to this huge famine to where, again, about 6 million individuals starved to death, not because they couldn't grow their work, but because the government was selling all of that, all of the produce in order to support money for industrialization. So some more goals and ideas behind this command or communist economy is to, again, accelerate industrialization, so dispersing that development. So again, the goals here are to shift to that industrialized society. Again, the idea is to spread the wealth, increase interconnectedness, and limit exposure to attack. Again, the reality, though, is they did become industrialized, but it was not efficient. So again, not equally distributed within that wealth. They didn't do a good job at becoming industrialized. Again, they didn't really have the money for it. So this construction here, for example, of the hydroelectric dam, unfortunately cost more than it should have. It took longer than it should have. And again, it led to a huge hit on their economy that then further led to famine as those resources were being sold to support it. So then the fall of that USSR to where we are now with modern Russia. So the USSR was dissolved in 1991. It was attributed both to economic and political factors. Again, that inefficiency of industrialization and collectiveness agriculture, because again, they were essentially a huge fail. That then allowed the USSR to be dissolved. There wasn't a lot of support. It was clear that it wasn't working well. So Russia is currently referred to as a republic, but it's been trending more toward authoritarianism under Vladimir Putin. So for example, just to kind of highlight this, in 2020, the constitutional amendments now allow Putin to rule until 2036. Previously, he would have been required to step down in 2024. However, because he has so much political power and authority, he was able to amend the Constitution to essentially allow him to remain for many, many more years without having to step down. So some of the, again, multiculturalism intention that we see from that ethnicity, again, just our definition, that group of people with common language, ancestry, and cultural history. Again, as Russia expanded into those regions, it forced cultural assimilation to where one group adopts the language and customs of another. So instead of both remaining kind of independent or welcoming each other, one essentially has to adapt to the other. However, this was not entirely successful, as you know, it is in multiple regions that we'll see. Again, submitting to another group is not something that comes naturally. So it's difficult in the outer regions. So those are the ones who have kind of remained independent, but because of that, again, they have also been shunned and they're not included in the economy, and it's harder for them. So that's generated a lot of resentment, of course, for the unequal treatment of those individuals. So the idea of Sovietization, so this is that cultural assimilation. So again, trying to get everyone to unite under one language and kind of one system. So what that kind of led to were these SSRs, which stand for Soviet Socialist Republics, which are kind of territories. Again, they're not countries, they're not really cities, but these are regions or territories that are comprised of different ethnic groups. And there are essentially two main ones in Russia. So the Uzbek USSR, the Uzbek SSR, and the Kazakh SSR. And those have led to today Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. So again, these are territories, kind of separate regions within Russia that share more of the same ethnicity, but they did not assimilate to Russian culture. So that included banning of languages, enforced resettlement, so removing troublemakers to Sovietize the SSR. So again, they wanted everyone in these territories to be the same. So you either conformed or you got out, or you were your life was made pretty miserable. So this was showing kind of where these territories are. So again, Kazakhstan here, this SSR, and then the Uzbek SSR, Uzbekistan. So again, they've kind of separated themselves. They're less diverse as far as their ethnicity in these two territories. But again, cultural assimilation to the most part has occurred in the rest of the Socialist Republic. So there are, of course, lots of conflicts that are occurring. Again, I just posted some links here to a lot of different videos, but you can find more information about all of these anywhere. But of course, the Ukraine war that is currently going on. So Ukraine is separate now from Russia, but of course, Russia is trying to invade it. That all comes down to resources and just territory. So Russia trying to take over and Ukraine trying to remain independent. And there are other conflicts as well. So if you're interested in these conflicts and some of the history behind it that has led to where current Russia is today, I encourage you to check those out.